But do we need lobsters that badly? Now I'm feeling guilty. If we're talking about, do we need football that badly? Do we need lobsters and cod that badly?
I guess not. Jess,
we do need roofs, I think.
We do need roofs. Yeah. Welcome once again to Free Associations from the Boston University School of Public Health, the Medical Journal Club podcast. For anyone who's confused by the latest health study, I am by why clouds don't freeze. So apparently we have an answer to the question.
Apparently we do. This is
for
fantastic.
Anyone who didn't listen to the last episode, I brought up for the second time my obsession with the fact that I believe clouds should freeze because it's very cold up where the clouds is, and clouds are made of water, and I do believe they do freeze. But Jess, you apparently have an explanation as to why you believe in your fantasy world they don't freeze. Go ahead.
This is totally out of my fantasy world. But I would like to just, say thank you to my TA, Erica Tietzel, who is a MPH student here at SPH.
Thanks, Erica.
Erica just emailed me this morning and said, hey, I wanted to say hi, hope you're doing well. P.S. I looked up why clouds don't freeze, and here's the answer. And then I did some additional research, and I think it's correct. And I said, whoa. And then she proceeded to paste into an email some very technical language that then I was like, oh, goodness gracious, Erica. It's at 0 degrees Celsius, water becomes ice. Concentration of water in the clouds is too low for the molecules. And I was like, this was like flailing over my head. And so I said to myself, why don't I text my husband, who's actually a physicist?
Okay.
And I was like, and I never, of course, thought to ask him before, as much as we've been talking about this over and over. So I sent him a text this morning.
Is that because he's a physicist, but you think he's not a very good physicist? Is that why?
Oh, no. We won't go there. He works with nanomaterials.
Ooh,
so
if you're listening, that was a joke.
That was definitely a joke. That was a joke. But anyway, so I texted him this morning. Hi, honey. Here's the text. Okay, I'll get some points back. Hi, honey. Do you know why clouds don't freeze? Like why they are not a sheet of ice in the sky when temperature is so high up in the sky or so low? And then I signed it XOXO.
Nice.
Right?
Sweet.
Okay, and he responds back as he typically does without any pleasantries and just says, there's a whole lecture related to this in my class. The short answer is that solid formation from a liquid is a process of nucleation and growth. For an ice crystal to form, it has to be of a certain size. You need to be pretty cold for ice to solidify from a spherical nuclei, as it might have to in a cloud, since there's no surfaces. I think this is the key. There's no surfaces because the sphere has a lot of surface area, and those water molecules don't want to stick around. In our freezer, for example, the ice typically solidifies on a surface, which makes it easier. It's called chemical kinetics. And then he linked me to Wikipedia pages and another Wikipedia page for a process called nucleation, which comes along with a picture of, they call it rock candy. Like rock, like
we
rock
made that
candy
in chemistry class.
Yeah.
Okay. So apparently this is a thing, and I said, "This is so amazing, thank you," with a heart.
Well,
not that I understand
So
it.
wait a minute. Does it freeze or does it not freeze?
He says
He's given us a lot of technical jargon.
I know, which is kind of like the jargon.
Does it freeze or not?
I have to say, even from Erica's description, he's saying it does not. I think that one of the reasons is that there is nothing for it to freeze onto.
Okay.
There's nothing for it to attach to.
But of course, snowflakes also follow the nucleation. It's little particles of dust, and then water condenses around them and settles to the ground.
Physicist Gil retorts.
Sure,
right,
I just know
but
everything.
they have to accumulate somehow, right? They're falling on the ground, or they're falling onto something. I'm just thinking
of
the
freezer.
freezer.
They turn into snow at some point in the air.
They turn into snow, but then they solidify.
And what about freezing rain? Because freezing rain falls from the sky as ice.
Pellets.
So where does that come from?
God.
Right.
So many unanswered questions.
Oh, no.
All right.
I made a terrible joke the other day.
Continued.
My wife gave me an icy stare.
What? Say that again? I didn't even get that. Nick got it.
Shall we continue on?
Okay. I would like to apologize to all of our collective spouses for this. No, I was all meant to be taken in jest, whatever was said. Okay. Anyway, I am Matt Fox from the Departments of Epidemiology and Global Health from the BU School of Public Health. I am joined by Dr. Jess Liebler from the Department of Environmental Health at the BU School of Public Health. Welcome, Jess.
Thank you.
And welcome to your entire family. And also joined by Dr. Chris Gill from the Department of Global Health at the BU School of Public Health. Welcome, Chris.
Hello.
And welcome to your entire family.
Thanks. They're all glad to be here, too.
I'm sure they are. And as a reminder, head on over to the Population Health Exchange website at www.pophealthex.org, which is BU's hub for lifelong learning. And Also, a reminder, we really would love another review. Ratings, we love the ratings, but a review lets us know how wonderful we are. And if it tells us how terrible we are, we just don't read it.
So this is mixed methods you're describing.
That's exactly what I'm talking about. Yep. So now on to the show. So today in our first segment, which is our Journal Club segment, we are going to look at a study on gestational age and cognitive outcomes. So how old you are at birth. Would that be a correct statement?
You're zero.
How old you are at birth?
You're zero.
Oh, okay. Well, then in the second part of the podcast, which is our deep dive, we're going to talk about questions around authorship, something that is near and dear to all of our hearts. And then in the third segment, which is our amazing and amusing, we'll get into things that make us laugh out loud or we just found fascinating. All right, segment one. So in segment one, the article that we're looking at, it was published in the BMJ and entitled Gestational Age at Birth and Cognitive Outcomes in Adolescence, Population-Based Full Sibling Cohort Study by first author Anders Husby of the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics at the School of Public Health at Imperial College London. I spent my sabbatical in 2019 at the Imperial College of London School of Public Health, but I fortunately didn't get to meet this person. So some headlines on this one. Premature birth linked to poorer school grades in adolescence, says Eureka Alert. Preterm birth tied to lower IQ and poorer school grades, says usnews.com. And lower grades in high school may be linked to being born prematurely, says MSN. So Jess, can you this was a study with a lot going on. So can you talk us through the main points?
Sure. This is a study with a lot going on, and it has a lot going for it, I actually think. It's pretty cool.
Agreed.
So just by means of background briefly, there is significant literature showing that the prenatal period is very important for many health endpoints later in life, specifically a growing literature on the developmental origins of chronic disease, which is looking to pinpoint specific periods of prenatal development that are associated with chronic disease risks that emerge in adulthood. And preterm birth is an established risk factor for many negative health endpoints, in part because some of the body systems have not finished completing development when the infant is, in fact, born, and development after birth in the postnatal period may not continue in the expected ways when babies are born prematurely. So in this paper, the authors are considering the specific association between preterm birth and cognitive outcomes. And they're doing this because for a number of reasons. First of all, this specific endpoint of cognitive outcomes has been difficult to assess in this relationship because of confounding in prior studies, they claim, as well as complexity in measuring cognitive endpoints across multiple domains of intelligence. And so I thought that was interesting that one of the things that they contribute through this study is looking at cognitive endpoints through multiple different approaches. And these authors used a national population-based full sibling cohort, which we'll talk about in a minute. This was the design of their study. It was based in Denmark, which is probably one of the very few places in the world where such a study like this could actually be accomplished by linking all of these different kinds of data over such a long period of time. And so that was pretty awesome. And so they conducted this study in Denmark to improve on the ability to account for multiple confounders, plus a more nuanced ability to consider cognitive functioning. They used the Danish Civil Registry System, which in Denmark is a national system that links medical records, health records, and school records. And in this system, they screened for full sibling pairs, and I think sometimes it wasn't just pairs, there were multiple siblings in the data, so not just pairs, but sibling groups, born between 1986 and 2003 using this retrospective cohort design. And their final sample included a little less than 800,000 full siblings in their eventual cohort, with approximately 5.5% of them born before 37 weeks of gestation, which was defined in the study as preterm. After 37 weeks was considered full term. Then what they did, which I thought was really interesting, is they looked at the timing of preterm, the extent that the baby was preterm. So they looked at less than 27 weeks, which they considered very early preterm, 28 to 31 weeks, which they considered early preterm, 32 to 33 weeks, late preterm, and then those that were born from weeks 34 by week up to week 42. So they did follow some babies post-term if they had that data. They then looked at endpoints across 3 different metrics. The first 2 were scores that extended from a national school-wise standardized exam that students took at the end of their compulsory education in Denmark, which was taken by all children except for some, which we can also talk about in a minute. And this test, my understanding, is taken at the end of 9th grade, at the end of compulsory education in Denmark. And so they looked at mean grades in written language and math on this test. They also conducted a sub-study of a smaller group of full sibling males who took an IQ test at the age of 18 as part of the mandatory military conscription process for Danish men. So they looked at these endpoints, written language and math from the Danish standardized test, and then a subset of results from this IQ test of men at 18 that was part of their conscription process. They ran many sensitivity analyses, including a notable one where they incorporated children in the study who did not take the school-based assessment and then imputed their scores. And they did this because of the assumption that almost everyone took this standardized test at the end of 9th grade, and if they did not take it, it was mostly due to cognitive abilities. And so they were interested specifically in this group of children. They adjusted their models for sex, birth weight, birth malformations, parental age at birth, parental education, and the number of older siblings. And these were some of the confounders that they said that were not included, specifically maternal education that had not been included in some of the prior assessments of the relationship between gestational age and cognitive outpoints. And then they compared adjusted Z-scores based on gestational age. And the use of the full sibling matching, which I thought was pretty cool, was done to allow for adjustment of other unknown or unspecified family-level confounders. And they noted also that they reran their models with an approach of clustering, of covariates clustered at the family level instead of sibling matching, and that the overall findings were more or less the same. So what their findings indicated was that 34 weeks of gestation appeared to be this significant threshold of relevance across all three of the cognitive measures that they looked at. So children born younger than 34 weeks of gestational age had reduced mean scores in the written language, mathematics, standardized tests, and lower IQ compared to children born at 40 weeks. Children born between 34 and 39 weeks, outcomes were basically undifferentiated from those who were born at 40 weeks across these three metrics. And they had some really nice figures, at least demonstrating this visually. And they found a negative linear relationship with these measures starting in 27 weeks, which was the youngest gestational age of the babies in their study, showing that there was a steady, almost a linear increase from 27 weeks to 34 weeks, at which point these scores stabilized at a level equal to the babies who were full term. And the IQ points, which I think is the IQ scores, is probably the easiest to contextualize compared to the mean Z-scores for math and reading. The authors observed a reduction of IQ points of 4.2 points, comparing babies born at 27 weeks to full-term babies, and up to 3.8 points in their next preterm period, and 2.4 points between the 32 and 33 week marker, which they claimed was a more or less linear relationship. And in one of the many sensitivity and parallel analyses that they ran, the authors imputed cognitive scores for children who did not complete the Danish standardized school-based assessments, and they imputed the 1% lowest standardized grade according to birth year, under the assumption that children who did not complete these assessments were cognitively unable to do so. And they found an even stronger relationship, indicating that potentially a disproportionate number of children scoring in those imputed low levels were preterm. The authors conclude that cognitive outcomes in adolescence did not differ between those born between 34 and 40 weeks of gestation, but that significant deficits did exist among infants born before 34 weeks.
Yeah, great cool summary. Chris, there was a lot to like here. What was your take on this one?
Totally agree with both of you. I thought this was such a cool paper, cleverly thought through.
Yeah.
If I could sort of harp on the one sort of salient point, which they even mentioned in the title, which is this full sibling cohort thing. And I think, Jess, you probably have a more elegant way, or Matt, of explaining it than I do. But the basic idea is that you've got a child, child one in the family who is born prematurely. And then you select families who had a second sibling who was not born prematurely. And so now you have, by comparing the premature and the non-premature child in the same family, you've eliminated all the unmeasured confounding that might exist in that pair related to the household and the rearing and all these other factors that would be fiendishly difficult to identify or measure. But now you don't have to identify or measure them because you've adjusted for them all by putting them into these pairs. And I just thought that was brilliant, actually. I was totally brilliant idea to do that.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I would quibble a little bit that they remove all the confounding because, of course, kids grow up in the same household.
In slightly different ways.
Have, different genetics, similar but not the same. And, a child born prematurely may be treated differently than a child not born prematurely. But by and large, they're growing up in roughly the same environment with similar, not the same genetics. And so I agree. To me, that's one of the huge strengths here. I also think, they're doing this in registry data in Denmark. So you've got the whole country, right? So limited selection bias too.
Yeah,
I mean, there is some potential because you do have the missing data, which has the potential, but they were very thoughtful about that, and they did a lot of sensitivity analyses. So I have some things that I could critique about this study, but I would put them all in the context of these are the kinds of things that I would write up if I were the reviewer of this study, saying, here's the ways I think you could improve this study, but overall I'm supportive of publication. So I think we could talk about some of those things, but I think we all agree this is a pretty impressive paper.
Yeah, no, I think one of the things, as I said, that was so impressive is that this couldn't be done in the United States to this level, for example, because of the lack of linkage of all these different types of records. The fact that you have an ID that then links you to health data and links you to birth outcome data and links to school data and then links to your military conscription.
Amazing, right?
Amazing. And the power of that for research, being able to have all of these disparate data sets linked. It was just tremendous. So I was blown away by that. Yeah.
One other tiny little sort of methodologic pearl that I thought was nifty was their use of Z-scores around the exams. And this sort of hit me in a weak spot because some numbers of years ago, we had done a trial of a mobile continuing medical education intervention in Vietnamese HIV doctors. And one of the features was that we gave them an exam at the beginning and we gave them an exam at the end, and we randomized them to get this intervention or not. And then we wanted to see, did their scores go up? But the challenge we recognized very early on in this was that it is almost impossible to make two exams equally difficult unless you have exactly the same, questions, in which case are you testing knowledge or you're testing memory of the first exam, which was only 6 months ago, right? And so they got around this by standardizing the average scores of every single year. And so that was in sort of another way of statistically leveling the field so that they could look at actual changes in the scores. And I thought that was clever and elegant and persuasive. And they also did that around the centiles of some of the other outcomes to sort of normalize all of these so that they're comparing apples and apples.
So let me ask you this. I mean, we're largely in agreement. I can point to some things that, I would have recommended doing differently, but we're largely in agreement. This is a good study. It's not a particularly surprising finding.
No, that's true.
So the question to me, and I say that not only because I suppose it's what I probably would have hypothesized, although I don't know that I would have said I know, whether it's going to be a small effect or a big effect. So fair enough. I mean, there's still something to estimate. But there have also been prior studies, right? This was not the first study to ever do this. So I guess my question is, do you think this has ended up in the BMJ, a pretty prestigious paper, because the methods were so good? In other words, it's not something we hadn't studied before. It's not something we didn't have a prior for. But this was the study maybe that really actually helped us hone in on what we think the size of the effects are because they did it well.
Yeah, I think that's probably right, Matt. And I'll come back to this business about full sibling matching, because that to me is the added sort of secret sauce on this paper that differentiates it from what it's before. Because similar analyses in the past could always be accused of having some bias or confounding based on household rearing patterns, and how do you get around that? But by matching it within siblings within the same household, they have largely countered that argument. And so now I think we're getting much closer to the shape of the true relationship, which admittedly was not all that different from what they had reported before. But now we can sort of say, yes, we are confident that the results are due to gestational age, not because of some hidden factor related to rearing.
I think one of the contributions of this paper is the 34-week threshold that I think was really clear across all three of the endpoints that they measured. And I could see that being filtered into kind of clinical practice almost recognizing that that's the age at which cognitive deficit would happen if the baby's born before. So maybe that being a threshold, thinking, about ways to preserve the pregnancy until after that point, for example. I thought that was it was an interesting. I was wondering, maybe this is a question for Chris.
Which they do.
Right? Yeah. The clinical relevance of this particular age. Compared to
I
33 weeks or 36 weeks.
This is where I wish Julie Hurley was here. She's a colleague of ours who's a pediatrician who could probably say something a little more sophisticated. But it is very clear that keeping the baby in as long as possible is important in so many ways. Not just because the babies who are very premature are going to have premature lungs and are going to have struggle breathing, but because there are all sorts of additional sort of neurologic and cognitive issues associated with prematurity. I think just as a mention, it's interesting that they truncated the analysis to sort of lump all the less than 27-week gestations together, which is, my guess is that the main reason was that at that point you're having very, very, very few of these events, and so it's hard to parse them and to cut them further. But at this point, it's also gilding the lily because it's very obvious at that point that the kids who were 27 weeks or below were so profoundly impaired on math and written and IQ tests. There was, what else are we going to learn from that other than it's going to continue to get worse? They
did have some, they did exclude babies. I don't remember what the lower threshold was. Do you remember where they did exclude below some for that reason?
Yeah, I don't know. But I was actually curious about this. So, obviously neonatal and infant mortality is quite low in this setting, but amongst babies born less than 27 weeks, I would think it would be relatively speaking high, right? And so this presumably, am I wrong about that, Chris?
I'm not sure I understand your question. Just walk it back for me.
Wouldn't being born very prematurely be associated with much higher mortality?
Yes.
Therefore, there may to a certain extent be a survivor bias because at those youngest weeks of gestation, it would be born prematurely, but then you have to survive long enough to get to the testing.
Right.
There's nothing you could do about that as far as I could see. I mean, there may be some clever statistical approaches, and I don't know that it's very large either. So I'm not trying to say that this is necessarily a huge problem, but it's something to think about.
Yeah, and in fact, the authors did consider this because one of the sub-analyses they did, which I thought was quite clever, was to look at the cascade of clinical interventions or events that had occurred in these children's lives as a way of saying, can we explain it all based on gestational age, or is it all the things that happened after they were born that contribute to this sort of intellectual impairment? And having adjusted for that, they still see that most of the effect is in fact explained by gestational age, not things that happen postpartum.
Right, and they specifically looked at number of major hospitalizations under the idea that if kids are hospitalized a lot, they're missing a lot of school, and so that could be what's causing this association. And it was nicely done. Yeah.
Yeah, the one sort of quibble was, and they don't totally do this, but I felt like they probably put a little too much weight into statistical significance here, because I do think, there is a pattern that is very clear that becomes not detectably different the farther along you get in the development, but there does actually seem to be sort of a pattern of, as you said, Jess, decreasing cognitive scores with decreasing weeks of gestation up to a point, and then it sort of flattens out. But it sort of seemed like they, at least in the abstract, if I remember correctly, focused on the significant, the place where you could determine significance. And I would quibble with that a little and say I think, it is true that we can only find from a statistical standpoint where the inflection point is. But there appears to be some, harm to being premature, but not severely premature. It also still seems to have some, some harm associated with not nearly as much as being very premature.
Yep. That's right.
Right. And I was interested too in terms of the meaningfulness aspect of the differences that they found in the math and writing scores. I think the IQ points are maybe easier to understand, and they were statistically significantly different, but it was unclear to me in the paper if that was at like a grade level difference or kind of what was the impact of that for the child and their family, that deficit.
Yeah. So what did you both make of the fact that the math scores were disproportionately, more severely impaired than the language scores? I thought I didn't know how to wrap my head around that.
Yeah, I didn't either. I felt like that would be the kind of thing where if you understood better, language and math development in children, you might have it might make more sense to me. I just didn't have the tools to be able to parse that, but it is noticeable.
I don't know anything about these Danish standardized tests, and I wondered too if knowing more about these tests would inform what it meant to score at different levels, or what the difference might be between the writing and the math.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I did. The other question I wanted to ask was, how do we interpret these results in light of what the two of you were discussing just a little bit ago, which is that this is a country where they are actually doing a lot to try and get those babies to,
stay in there.
As long as possible. And so this is not a scenario in which we're analyzing data in which babies are just, doing whatever and we just see what happens. This is in the context of already presumably a lot of intervention, I don't know what a lot of means, but a place where, as much intervention as possible could be happening to try and preserve that, such that, do we interpret these results to mean that there's probably nothing more you could do, at least in, today's day and age, to get these kids to higher gestational ages, and therefore really probably the main way that we interpret these findings is as a prediction measure. In other words, we identify that if you were born very prematurely, there may be knock-on effects in terms of your cognitive development, and therefore you may require early intervention. It's not that the message is, therefore, we are going to get these kids to be longer gestational age, because we probably can't do all that much more at this point. I don't know that's true. I just that's where my mind goes to.
Yeah, I mean, if I sort of compare this with the work we do in Zambia, where we, follow infant cohorts, and the rates of prematurity appear to be so much higher than what we encounter in the United States. And so, the issue that we're describing here in Denmark, where, presumably it's the Cadillac of prenatal care, some of the best and the best and the best on the planet. And, and their rates of extreme prematurity based on these data is very, very low. But, nonetheless, there are a lot of babies being born in Denmark, and so you can measure this effect. But the implications of this are really I'm thinking about, well, what about in global health, where the prematurity issue is much more significant?
Yeah.
And what does that add up to on a continental level in terms of all these children who are surviving and going on and having damaged brains for the rest of their lives? It's kind of it's a terrifying thought, to be honest. So.
Absolutely. But so I guess then my question would be, can we interpret this solely as the effect of prematurity, or do we think this is the effect of prematurity plus any interventions that were designed to try and prevent the prematurity?
Or subtracting the things that they did afterwards to support these kids who were born prematurely.
Either one, right? I mean, presumably there is the potential that some of the interventions that we might try to increase the duration of the pregnancy might also have some harms. Right, and so hard to say exactly. I doubt they're much.
But I mean, one can sort of imagine a crazy thought experiment where, a baby is taken out of the womb and kept alive in some perfect environment that approximates the womb, and is allowed to then develop in this other environment that does not put them at risk of being exposed to germs and pathogens, and the immaturity of their lungs doesn't matter because they're still in some environment where the surfactant, is, they don't have to worry about their lungs collapsing and developing respiratory distress syndrome. So, you wonder, is it the gestational age per se? Probably not. My guess is that is that when a child comes out so early, they're suddenly exposed to all these massive stressors and insults in the environment that they would have faced, 10 weeks later if they had made it to term and been that much more resilient. But because they're coming out so early, they lack that resilience. And so they take all these hits from infections. They take all these hits because their lungs are immature and collapse, and they spend the first 2 weeks of their lives with some degree of hypoxia. And the brain is just starved for oxygen. My guess is it's not the gestational age per se. It's the fact that so much of that period is spent being bombarded by terrible environmental assaults. And that's what probably leads to this. But again, I really wish we had a proper neonatologist here to be more sophisticated about this.
I think it's a combination. I think it's a combination of the stressors that the infant would experience after birth, and also that systems are not finished developing.
Right.
And so it's a combination of those things, that the body's under a tremendous amount of stress at obviously an age where maybe that was unexpected, and also that there's systems that are just not ripe yet to be functioning outside of the womb. I only know about this in the context of kidney disease because of my work in Central America. Kidney development extends through weeks 36 and 37 of pregnancy. And so babies that are born preterm, and likewise in Central America, there's really high rates of babies that are born preterm. Their kidneys are just not done. They're not done
ready.
developing. They're just not ready. And so whatever assaults that happen later, it happens on a kidney that didn't fully develop. Yeah, so I was reading this study from a similar perspective that you were, with the understanding that whatever gaps we're seeing, this is a highly privileged population in terms of access to care and access to obstetric care, access to interventions for the babies after birth, that this is almost the floor in terms of the difference that you might see in other contexts between prematurity and babies born at term, that this is maybe the minimum effect that you would see given the context of this country.
Yeah, I think you said that much more eloquently than me, so thank you. That was generally the trite of argument I was trying to express, but you put it so well, Jessica. I mean, we in the infectious disease world and the respiratory pathogen world, think a lot about maternal antibodies, and as you probably both know, that most of the maternal antibody transfer occurs in the third trimester after 28 weeks, and so you can again see, here is another mechanism sort of thrown in that puts these kids at tremendous risk of when they come out too soon. So,
yeah, no, we want to avoid
great study.
Prematurity at all costs. I think we all agree. Really nice study. Well done to these authors. So let's then move on to our second segment. So we are going to look at a study from the BMJ from 1996, and Chris suggested this article, and I think at first when we first looked at it, thought, well, this is great. And then we saw it's from 1996 and thought, well, is it really relevant? And then we thought, actually, it is, because we actually want to sort of see what's changed. What's changed since then. So the article was entitled "The Vexed Question of Authorship: Views of Researchers in a British Medical Faculty" by Bhopal and colleagues, and basically get at the idea of, you got to publish in academia if you're going to succeed. But, that sort of came with all kinds of negative consequences, such as just putting people on papers just for the sake of getting your name on things, but people had nothing to do with it, or getting people to write papers.
Fox to my paper to get it published.
Exactly.
Writing is coattails to success.
Exactly.
Kind of
So in 1985, the International Committee on Medical Journal Editors published criteria for authorship based on the principles each author should be able to defend the work publicly, which
Amen to that.
What's that?
Amen to that.
We haven't even gotten through it. We're already to the point. No, because I'm into that sort of, right? I mean, we are in a world now where research has become very you need a lot of very specialized skills, and it isn't always possible for every person to be able to defend every piece of a paper.
True, but at
the same time,
we've jumped way ahead.
Yeah,
but okay, we'll come back to the beginning after. This is like a Michael J. Fox moment. But I think sort of in big picture terms, if we're saying,
Nick had to explain to me the Michael J. Fox reference. You were referencing Back to the Future.
Back to the Future,
I didn't
right?
get it.
That was
Did that go over people's heads?
It went over mine. Nick had to explain it to me.
Do you know about Back to the Future movies?
Nick explained it to me.
Okay.
Like telepathically just now.
He whispered it to me.
I saw him making a gesture, and it caught me in my tracks, and it just stopped me.
Sorry, go ahead.
Anyway, but what I was going to say is, like, there are sort of holistically, you can say, like, if you have a co-author on your paper who, if like pigeonholed at a bar, could not possibly explain what the paper was about or what the point was, they should probably not be on the paper.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that. I mean, but can you explain sort of all the technical details?
Yeah,
right? Can you explain the modeling details?
This is where it gets tremendously muddy and murky. Yeah. So let's go back to the future.
So the basic idea was
the three criteria.
Yeah,
Back to the Future in 1997.
Yeah, I remember. How old were we when they came? Was it 1985 or something?
Well, first of all,
the criteria,
we were
and then
the
there's
same
this
age.
paper.
I was much older back then.
Yes,
I was in high school in 1997.
It was in the 80s. Nick, what year? You know all things. What year was Back to the Future?
The movie.
No. When did it come out? When did the movie come out? Oh,
that's a much more complicated question.
It was in the 80s.
Jess, you should ask your graduate students.
Yeah,
I should.
Exactly.
Maybe they will email me with this answer after this episode. Right.
I heard there's this thing called Google. We could check it out.
Is that new?
It's pretty new. Yeah.
Huh.
Apparently, it answers all sorts of questions. You just type into the keyboard thing.
Can I get that with my Gmail account?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I got that too.
Okay, so the idea of the paper was that they wanted these folks wanted to determine whether people knew what these new.
Wait, but so this just to clarify, as we're getting very goofy, just to clarify, so this paper was written in 1997, and they were asking people in 1996. They were asking people in 1996 what they thought of recommendations that came out in 1985.
Basically, whether or not they knew they existed, what they were. So in other words,
and most of them didn't.
Did they know what the criteria that the journals were saying were required? 10 years later, were required for authorship.
Okay.
And
mostly did.
To give away the punchline, they interviewed 70 academics and research staff from the Faculty of Medicine at University of Newcastle, and found, as Chris says, that most of them didn't. And to the extent that they did, many of them thought, I think, that they were not, particularly, didn't like all of them per se. And so I guess the question is, do you think this still holds true today? In other words, have we gotten better at getting the message to people as to what the criteria for authorship are? And then assuming that they know, which I'm not assuming, but if they do they follow them?
Yes, no, yes. No.
Yes,
maybe. No. I don't think so. My recent experience is they don't know.
People don't know.
And if they know, they don't follow them.
And if they know, they don't follow them.
People have different criteria. I mean, I think even among faculty or even among collaborators I've worked with, I think people have different criteria for what constitutes authorship. And everyone kind of has their own set of rules. And it's hard because research is really complicated now. I mean, any given project has people in the laboratory, has people in the field, has statisticians, has, the epi people with study design, has a number of students and staff people.
Collectors.
Data enters, interviewers. And so
database developers.
Right. And so it's really difficult sometimes to constitute what authorship is, and then also difficult to expect that every one of those folks who is an author would know every element of the study.
Yeah, I think we're never going to get to the point at which everybody could know every element and be able to defend every element. But I would agree with your general point, Chris. Everybody who's listed on the paper should be able to defend the general concept of the paper. If you can't even say what the paper was about and why basic decisions were made, it's hard to say that you are at the level of being able to be an author. But there are also cases where it's not always clear. Like, so if somebody has painstakingly developed a novel database that they then allow you to use for your research, but that's all their contribution. I mean, they'll read the manuscript and edit it, but they don't really contribute intellectually in any way.
They're not framing the hypothesis
to the
or
question,
the
analysis, any of those things. Does that person deserve to be? I mean, do we acknowledge the contribution of the novel data sets? Right. I'm not talking about just sort of putting somebody on because they could get access to a bunch of data. I'm saying they linked together.
They curated
novel data.
The data.
They curated it. They cleaned it. All those things that would make it novel. Do they deserve to be on it?
Maybe, but it's definitely in the gray zone there.
I would agree. I would agree. I'm not sure.
I feel like if the research couldn't happen without that contribution, if you couldn't have done the study without that data set, then I would say yes.
So the research, I would say, couldn't happen without the data collectors. Should the data collectors be on there?
Maybe.
I'm not clear. Like, maybe.
Right.
Yeah,
maybe they should.
Yeah.
But I don't think they would meet the criteria that are laid out in the...
They definitely would not.
But the people who were interviewed in this study kind of pushed back on these criteria. Did you see they did a series of qualitative interviews with these folks? And
this is
a lot of them
really
said these criteria. So there's 3 criteria that came out in 1985.
Yep.
Criteria for authorship: that conception and design or analysis and interpretation of data, and drafting the article or revising it critically, and final approval of the version. And so even, in 1996, researchers were saying, but there's all these other functions that are really important outside of these 3 that are excluded, and that these criteria might systematically exclude students from authorship and staff people from authorship and data collectors, as you were talking about.
Yeah, and one thing we should add is that the ICMJE committee is not saying that you must have met one or more of these criteria. It is saying they said you must have met all three of these criteria.
Right. Yep.
And that is a very high standard.
So
So like, you
right,
raise the issue of students. Like, is a student who you brought on to, like, you've got this analysis, it's a great analysis, you don't have the bandwidth to do it, you go find a crackerjack student who knows a lot of SAS and EPI, who's looking to do something cool, and you say, here's this project idea I have, go execute the plan. So they do that project, and then they write the paper, do the analysis, write the paper, and then other people that contribute to that. But the problem is, according to this, they didn't conceptualize the paper because it was your idea. Does that now deprive them of authorship? I mean, that seems to be like taking it way to an extreme.
I don't think
it's just
so.
Not practical anymore.
I don't think these results or these recommendations are typically interpreted that way, because there's typically one or maybe two people who ever conceptualize a study, in which case that would imply there really should only be two authors.
Right.
And I think we would all agree that is in our field untenable.
Yeah.
And then you see these papers, like these genome-wide, association studies that people pull together,
authors,
and you get just pages and pages of authors, or the global burden of disease studies, where you just get all these authors. Did every one of them conceptualize it? No. So I don't think they're interpreted quite that way, but I see why you're saying that, and it does seem to be a very high bar.
Say that the entire field has agreed to ignore these criteria because we really, literally do not pay attention to them anymore, and we feel like if we had tried to do so, we would feel very awkward about it and bad and guilty and feel like we were cheating our colleagues by doing so. If to be so pure in this just seems to be almost farcical to me.
So why? So then let's back up. Why were these criteria put in place, and were they put in place for good reason? I mean, at the time they probably were. Because, have we gotten to the point where we would say we'd reevaluate things and say, data collectors are just as important to the completion of the work as the PI? I mean, in terms of, being able to accomplish this, their names should be on this paper, even if they are not at the level at which they could completely explain what was done. I don't know.
I feel like these criteria were put, it's interesting. So these were criteria that were also put in place for medical journals, and we could discuss if we think public health research is different or epidemiologic research is different in any meaningful ways or not. But it seems like these were put in place to deal with bloat, that as it became more and more important to have lots of publications, you could say, okay, I'm putting out a paper. I'm just going to put on all my friends as co-authors and all the people in my department and my department chair, and, we'll just have 50 authors and that's fine. And then everyone's happy. Everyone gets a new publication on their CV. So it was kind of to deal with that bloat, that kind of bloat in the authorship. But then the flip side is exclusion, which is, I think, where we were maybe before the bloat, where the papers were more likely to have one or two authors. They were typically all men, and anyone who was involved in the research in any way downstream from the conceptualization was not an author. And so now it's kind of like, I think there's more of at least in public health, there's more of an inclusive approach and recognition of the diversity of contributions, but it kind of leads a little more towards that bloat factor. Like, I also have papers that have 12, 14 co-authors, and they don't all contribute equally, and I know that as the PI, and I know that not every single person could defend the statistical method that we chose or any of these, field research decisions, but they contributed in some way that was important to the final product coming together.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I think that it makes, and I have to say, I've changed my views on this. I originally just sort of took these principles as dogma and said, no, authorship should be very limited. And I've since realized it's actually problematic. I'm much more sympathetic to the idea that we should be more inclusive the less well-paid somebody is, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, because those are often the people who are doing probably the stuff that is, it is just essential. I mean, we don't get the data without data collectors. When you get to the higher levels of pay, then you are probably in the situation where you're including people just for the sake of including them, because those are the people who probably have the expertise to be able to take full responsibility for all of it, but don't, because they don't really know what is going on in this paper. They were just put on there, and there I would have a problem with that. So it's sort of, I have a problem with it at both ends, and I don't know what to make of that. But there are places where you put the department chair on your paper, whether they had anything to do with the work or not. I mean, that just seems to me absurd. So I wouldn't want to support that I'm not opposed to including department chairs in your research. I'm just saying you don't put them on there.
Just for the record.
Yeah, you don't put them on there just because they were your department chair. So I want to be probably a little bit more exclusive at that end, but on the other end, I want to be more inclusive. So yeah.
I mean, I'm curious if either of you, my guess is probably yes, have found yourself feeling rather uncomfortable about the inclusion or potentially exclusion of individuals as you're sort of wrestling with these issues. I know I have recently, in fact.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. I mean, I think this comes up
all the time.
Yeah, and we're working on a study now, and we wrote a protocol paper. It's for a trial, so there's a lot of people involved, and we've had people who have come in, made really important contributions to the study in terms of it being able to actually function and get off the ground. And these are people who may be, at the study coordinator level at the moment, but have aspirations to build a career in academia. It's of value to them to be on a paper, and they've had strong contributions, but then they move on. Do we just say, oh, well, you weren't there when the data came in, so your contributions are not going to be acknowledged? I don't want to do that.
It's an interesting question, too, of whether or not you as a researcher advocate for your own authorship at all. I feel like I've had this situation where I have felt like I should be included because of contributions, especially on the intellectual side to the conceptualization of the project. And I typically don't advocate, and either I'm not around by the time an analysis, whatever, because I'm doing something different, or I see it with students too, or with program coordinators. And the question is and I never know how to approach someone and say, hey, remember me? Without sounding obnoxious.
Yeah, I think there's a bigger problem there that you were put in that position to begin with, right? That the person who used your intellectual labor didn't acknowledge it, and you had to go and ask for it is the real problem.
Yes.
Well, this happens frequently to junior researchers, that you're involved in early conversations. This has happened to me many times, where you're involved in early research conversations, and then you are subbed out for someone senior in the actualization of the project. Right. And I think there's no claim to authorship in that circumstance, but I think as a junior researcher, there is a jockeying for your role in a project at times. And it's kind of an issue of when do you lay claim to your intellectual contributions and when do you let it go?
I think you lay claim to your intellectual contributions when you have intellectual contributions. I mean,
but then you run into the power dynamics.
Yeah,
I agree. And you start to wonder, is the fight worth if I win this battle, have I lost a war?
Yeah, that's a good point.
And you don't want to come across as obnoxious and a bad colleague. And
I think shouldn't be taken advantage of.
Is this more common if you were a woman researcher?
It might be. I don't know. I haven't conducted any research on it, but I think there are certain. These are kind of big issues for junior people if you're included or not included on a research paper, especially larger scale ones. And it's not always clear what to do if you're in that group and you don't know exactly what your role is.
So somebody I won't name them on this podcast has reminded me many times that, authorship, but credit more generally, not specifically authorship, is something that is not diminished the more people claim it. Right, so there is no harm to
I like that
being more inclusive. Again, within the limits of what is
within some boundaries,
within what is actually a contribution. But what is the harm to allowing more people who actually contributed to be listed as contributors?
I agree with that.
It doesn't reduce your ability to also claim the work. It just seems to me.
Yeah.
Being a good citizen would mandate that. I hope I have actually done what I'm saying here. I know there were times early in my career when I didn't feel this way, and I know I wouldn't have. But I hope that since then, it isn't a case where this is what I'm saying, but when it actually comes around to it, I don't even think about somebody who maybe had a contribution early and I just moved on and didn't think about it. I suppose that is entirely possible, but I would hope that I wouldn't leave somebody off just because it was sort of like, let's just move on.
I don't know. I think also part of it is that the acknowledgments component of a paper really has no meaning.
I don't even do them because I often feel like they are more for us to say thank you to somebody who's never going to read this. I mean, we often will thank the participants, right? Where they obviously can't be authors, and that seems appropriate. But at the same time, like thanking specific people, I don't know. I also worry sometimes that people thank somebody to get their name into the acknowledgments to say they sort of gave us feedback kind of thing, so that it gives it a bit more, oh, this paper's kind of already really been peer reviewed by such and such an important person.
That is very self-serving, isn't it?
I do worry that. I'm not saying people do that. I'm saying I worry that it will come off that way.
I bet they do that. Yeah, I bet it's every angle you can imagine can be exploited.
Sure.
Has been. Can we, before we move off on this topic, let me just ask you one more odd permutation, which is how you deal with co-authors who died before the paper was written.
Yeah,
That's happened to me twice in the last year, in fact.
Yeah, I don't think it's ever happened to me, but I know people it's happened to. I think the answer is you include them.
I mean, I did.
You include them.
But according to the criteria, that would be not allowed.
Yeah, I don't.
Because they did not have an opportunity to approve the final version of the paper because they were dead.
Include them. I mean, I've definitely seen, first of all, I've seen it happen. I've seen lots of cases, not lots of cases. I've seen cases. In fact, I saw one just the other day. Fortunately, it was.
I'm pretty sure they would have agreed with it.
Yeah,
but technically, they didn't have a chance.
I say include.
I agree with you. But another example of where you can't apply these criteria. These are aspirational, right?
Of course.
They're trying to steer us in a slightly more specific way than this fellow they quote, Hewitt. They actually give a lovely quote from Dr. Hewitt, I assume, from 1957, who said, "Thou shalt not allow thy name to appear as a co-author unless thou hast some authoritative knowledge of the subject concerned, hast participated in the underlying investigation, and hast labored on the report to the extent of weighing every word and quantity therein." So very biblical of him. Anyway, we get the idea.
Right.
Get the idea. All right. Let's move on to our last segment.
Dr. Hewitt.
Let's move on to our last segment, our Amazing and Amusing. We're long on time, so I'm going to go first and I'm going to go quickly. So I just wanted to pass on this paper from the BMJ Christmas edition. That is, I think, is the BMJ Christmas edition is generally funny. This one I think is actually a bit more serious. It was sort of written in a funny way, but I think it's a serious paper. It's written by a group of the BMJ statistical editors, entitled "On the 12th Day of Christmas, a Statistician Sent to Me." And it's basically a list of their 12 things that they would like to see from people. And I thought they were just again, it was a BMJ Christmas edition, so it's lighthearted, but I think it's a serious message. And so I thought it was just worth passing these on. So they say, they write this all in the form of "The first day of Christmas, a statistician said to me." And these are the things that they would be saying. Number 1, clarify the research question. Number 2, focus on estimates, confidence intervals, and clinical relevance. After my own heart. Don't focus on statistical significance. Carefully account for missing data. Yep. Do not dichotomize continuous variables. Mm-hmm. Oh. Consider nonlinear relationships.
Sometimes you can.
What?
I do that because sometimes you have to get at the clinical relevance.
We do it all the time, but you lose information and you sometimes create additional biases that way.
Maybe they should say "thou shalt mostly not." Okay,
mostly not.
Unless it's better that you should.
Quantify differences in subgroup results. That one I have a little bit of an issue with, actually, because I think we should do that in cases where it's justified and has an a priori hypothesis, but I think we run into problems when we do that too much. But anyway, consider accounting for clustering. Then
Set 5 gold rings.
Exactly. Interpret I-squared and meta-regression appropriately. Okay, probably we're getting into the weeds here. Assess calibration of model predictions. Okay, we're getting into a lot of specific things. But
this is a statistical Christmas.
Yeah, I'm not gonna go through all of them. But the point is, like some of those basic things. Like, make sure you have a good research question before you go to a statistician.
Oh.
Don't dichotomize variables when there's a linear, nonlinear, or
a linear relationship.
There's a trend going on that you can quantify. And don't lose that information. Focus on statistical. Don't focus on statistical significance. Things like that. So I just thought it was a nice article. Chris.
All right. I was, as many of you probably were, shocked and dismayed at the cardiac arrest of Damar Hamlin. Did I get his name? Hamlin. Damar Hamlin. In the football game a couple weeks ago. And, relieved, as I'm sure we all were, at his full recovery.
I have to say, it was one of the most devastating moments.
Were you watching?
Yeah, I was watching it. Yeah. And I love football, but I hate football. And so it's very hard to...
Well, I don't know where my presentation here is going to go with that, because I was very curious to know how dangerous is football.
I think you might, for anyone who is not maybe in the U.S., you might need to explain what happened.
Well, he tackled another player on the other team, so he did the hit, and then they all went down in a heap, and then he stood up, and then he went down hard, bang, and just collapsed. and he was pulseless, and they had to defibrillate him and do CPR in the field. And then he was whisked off to the cardiac care unit where he, recovered after a couple of days and was apparently fine. But it was a terrifying moment that was on national TV. Millions of people watched this guy have a cardiac arrest on television.
And I think a lot of us thought he had died.
We thought he had died, right. So it was quite it was a terrifying moment in sort of the American zeitgeist. So anyway, I was curious afterwards, like how many people die playing football. And I stumbled across a report, I looked for it and found it, called the Annual Survey of Football Injury Research, which goes all back to 1931 and tabulates all the deaths that occur at different levels of play, like middle school, high school, college, and pro ball, all the way back to 1931. And it's a very interesting read, but it led me to a slightly different place. But before I do, I just wanted to highlight a couple of the statistics that I thought were really shocking, which is that since 1966, there have been 362 deaths in middle and high school football. But in pro ball, 7.
So
but there's many more people playing high school
part
ball.
of that is a numbers game.
It's a much bigger numbers game.
Yep.
But when they actually correct for that and look at rates, it actually is interesting that the high school mortality rates are slightly higher than the pro mortality rates. And then if you look at spinal cord injuries, it's much, 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 much higher in high school than it is in pro ball, which I don't understand why, because you would think it was much rougher, but nonetheless. And there was one year in here that was particularly grim where there were like something like 40 or 60 deaths in a single year.
In high school?
And no, this was like I think in 1930 something or other.
But in high school football or all football?
In all football. Oh. In all football. At any rate, the final number that came out of this report in terms of the overall deadliness of America's favorite sport is, for pro ball at least, is 0.5 deaths per 100,000 players per year. So that is the number. Okay, so it is a measurably slightly dangerous game. I don't know how that compares with hockey, which would be the obvious comparator of another very rough game, but probably higher than that for other reasons. But I was then like, okay, well, how dangerous is that on a relative scale compared with other things that people do? And so I found this report with data from the National Labor Statistics people, looking at the most dangerous professions in the world. Or I guess this is probably America. And I'm curious, would either of you like to hazard a guess as to what the number 1, 2, and 3 most dangerous jobs are?
Timber.
Timber is number 2. Very good.
That would be my guess.
So lumber.
Police.
Fire.
Police and fire.
They are. Police and fire is not on the top 10.
Construction.
Construction, and specifically, what kind of construction? What kind of job in construction is the worst of all?
Oh.
Climbing high on things.
Yes, roofers.
Yeah, roofers. Okay.
Roofers. That is number 3 on the list. Roofers. Falling off roofs would be the obvious reason why they die. And then the number 1 most dangerous job of all is fishing.
Oh, fishing.
And including America's Dangerous Captain and the crabs fishing. So now, remember that the death rate for football was 0.5 per 100,000 players per year. Anyone want to guess what the mortality statistics are for fishers?
So it's 0.5 per 100,000 for football. I'm going to go with 3 per 100,000.
3, so about 10 times higher.
I'm going to go even higher, like 30.
30, okay. The actual number is about 140.
Per 100,000.
Per 100,000.
Wow,
so 250 times higher risk of dying if you are a fisherman than a football player. And I don't think they get paid as well.
No.
Now you could say, and not to be flippant about it. I mean, fishing is people need fish. It's it's sort of a necessary job, and football is for pleasure. So why accept any risk? But and I was actually stunned at how comparatively safe football was.
What about roofing?
Being a lobsterman?
Well, yeah.
Oh, and do you want to know the numbers for roofing? So loggers in the timber industry is about 90, and for roofers is about 50.
Wow. So
500 times higher than for football players is roofing.
Roofing.
Yeah. Wow. In fact, did I get the math wrong? 145 times divided by 0.5 is 250. So for roofers, it would be about 100 times higher.
Oh, boy. Well, and then definitely not.
Wow. Anyway, the numbers kind of...
Not going on my roof.
Is that your
I'm
second
thinking
career as
summer
a roofer
job for college students.
Right,
roofer should not be, or fisher, not on the list.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay. Well,
but do we need lobsters that badly? Now I'm feeling guilty. If we're talking about, do we need football that badly? Do we need lobsters and cod that badly?
I guess not.
It is. I mean, it is true though that when people die in other professions, it doesn't cause a national conversation about the risk in that field.
Absolutely true.
We do need roofs, I think.
We do need roofs.
We do need roofs. Yeah. Jess, I hope you have something uplifting to end on.
That was so jolly. Sorry.
I do, and it's interesting. This is actually my favorite paper that I have read in a very long time, and it's from PNAS, and it was just published in the last couple of weeks. The title is Cleaner Fish Recognize Self in a Mirror via Self-Face Recognition Like Humans.
Wow.
And so this is quite different. Cleaner fish, which is a particular, I had to look this up, is a particular
it's a
type
kind
of fish.
Oh, like the clown wrasse.
It's a fish that like sucks parasites off of other fish.
Like Nemo.
I guess. No, not a clownfish. That's a clownfish.
They're wrasses. They do that.
Oh, okay.
They pick parasites off.
I think that's what, So this is like a type of fish. So you know this type of fish.
The cleaner a fish, if a fish has taken a bath, it's more likely to recognize itself, which is what I interpreted.
Like, oh, my face is clean now. I've washed my face, so I'm clean now.
Yeah.
So apparently in evolutionary biology, there is they distinguish between animals that can self-identify in a mirror and those that cannot. Okay. And this is a big test of intelligence. And the question is, does that relate to self-awareness, this kind of internal sense of internal identity?
Yeah.
And so the way they do this with different animal species is they show the animal like a mirror image of themselves, and then they put some sort of mark on them. And they look to see if the animal tries to remove the mark on its own body. So in the sense that like I see that image and I realize it's me and I'm going to take it off by and they put like a dot on the head and they try to take it off
the sticker or something.
Peel off the sticker. And so there are certain animals that have done this successfully, like dolphins and certain types of whales and certain types of primates. And the cleaner fish is now in this list where they did this experiment with this type of fish where and it was fascinating. And so they're trying to get at, so the cleaner fish could identify itself with a mark on its throat. And so what they did is they show, you have to initiate the awareness in animals that obviously don't have access to a mirror to kind of show, okay, this is you. This is you. And so they did a series of experiments with this fish where they showed the fish the mirror and the fish, was kind of looking at the mirror. And then they showed the fish a mirror image of itself with a mark on its throat, and the fish tried to remove it from its throat. And then they had two images that they showed the fish, one where they removed the fish's face and put it on the body of another fish, and another image where they showed an altogether different fish. And the fish attacked the different fish, recognizing some sense of self, even in the picture where they superimposed the fish's face on the body of another fish. And then they did a series of experiments involving both mirror self-recognition and also photographic recognition. I thought this was fabulous. And the bigger point of this research, which they're now saying should be extended to all other different types of animal species, is the idea of, does this self-recognition involve self-awareness and kind of the origins of identity and of awareness of self, and kind of talking about that there's these different components of self-awareness. There's self-awareness of your body, and that's maybe the first level. And then there's kind of self-awareness of your soul and your thoughts and your interactions with other members of your species. And so they were pushing that. It was not just bodily self-awareness, but it was kind of going into this internal self-awareness, kind of they call it intimate self-awareness or introspective self-awareness in fish. And so really challenging the idea that humans are the only species that are capable of this sort of awareness of self. And they also made a point at the end of the article that these tests where they put an animal in front of a mirror with some sort of mark, like they say, this is you, and then this is you with a mark, and to see if they remove the mark, that it's dependent on, obviously, the capacity of the animal to remove the mark.
Right.
And so not all animals have hands that can, or legs that can, and so they were making the point that they needed to redo some of these earlier experiments in a way where they could tell if the animal actually, could remove the mark.
Yeah.
Because they were saying some of the, the dot study isn't appropriate, but it has been used to determine which are the animals that have this higher level sense of self.
So we need new self-awareness tests.
I recommend
for ants.
This was a great paper in the anthropology space in PNAS, and so it's by a group of Japanese authors, Koda et al. In Osaka. It was brilliant. So if anyone has a few minutes, take a look.
That's one to read. All right, well, that is the end of our program. If you've got any feedback on this or any other episode, or you want to suggest a study or a topic for us to take on, you can always find us on the Population Health Exchange website at www.pophealthex.org. Somebody pointed out the other day that saying www is much longer than saying World Wide Web.
Yes.
Yeah, because
three vowels, three syllables.
versus world.
It's also, and then you just sound like www. It's just, it's hard to say in any kind of professional way.
So you can find it at World Wide Web, pophealthex.org.
Just don't type that in.
You can just write,
And now I find out from Nick that you don't even need the www.
Just .pop.
So, right? Just dot. Just start with dot. No. pophealthex.org. You don't even need the www. We want to thank Leslie Talali, an Assistant Dean of Lifelong Learning at the BU School of Public Health. I don't want to send people there. For supporting the podcast, and Nick Guler for sound editing and identifying website names and
his Back to the Future.
And Mark Takakji for editing. Thanks for joining us. We hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you'll download our next episode.